will be recorded, so you will be able to revisit information that you may have missed or would like to hear again. You'll also be able to share the link with any friends who may be interested. While we can't see or hear you, we invite you to submit your questions through the Q&A function, which our team will vet and share with our speaker, Brian Van Eerden, to answer live following his presentation. To find this function, just move your mouse so that you see the cursor and look to the bottom of your screen. You can actually do this right now while I'm telling you, and you'll see it. Several options should appear when you move your mouse there at the bottom of the screen, including one that says Q&A, and it's got a little dialogue icon. If you click on that icon and submit your question there, we will be able to get to it. And we will get to as many questions as possible in the time allotted. If there are questions that we're unable to answer before the webinar ends, please rest assured that we will answer them after the fact, and we will send out the responses to the group so everybody can get that good information. And we do ask that you please be sure to keep an eye out for supporting materials, which our staff will share in the chat box to the side of your screen, as well as a couple of polls to which we hope you'll respond. So with that, I'll hand it over to our State Director, Locke Ogans, who will introduce herself and our speaker.
Thanks, Margaret, and welcome everybody. I'm Locke Ogans, and I'd like to welcome you to the very first, as Margaret said, in a series of webinars that we look forward to bringing to you all. Thank you so much for joining. I think there were over 150 people registered for this webinar, and we're really glad to have every single one of you. I want to especially recognize some current and former Virginia trustees, Cab Grayson, Cliff Hutchins, Wick Mormon, Galen Layfield, Brian Ball, and Chairs Porter, who are on our call. And if I missed anyone who is a trustee or a former trustee, let us know in the chat box. And I also want to extend a really special welcome to Bill Owen, who is a landowner in Sussex County and a great friend of the Conservancy and a true leader in longleaf pine conservation. So thank you, Bill, for joining us today. We are really, really grateful for your interest in our work, and we're super grateful for your support, because without you all, we couldn't achieve our conservation goals. And so thank you for being part of this first seminar. Before we start, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that, like you, I've been struggling with the events in the world of the past week and spending a lot of time thinking about how I can do more myself personally to be part of the solution, and about what actions our chapter can take. And we are going to be having discussions about that in the weeks to come. But in these times that are full of tumult, I'm happy that we can bring you some good news about our natural world. And I hope that this webinar will be a source of some respite and relief for each of you today. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Brian Van Eerden, who's the director of our Virginia Pinelands program. Brian's been with TNC for 20 years. He manages the Conservancy's land acquisition and forest management projects across southeastern Virginia. And Brian holds an MS degree in botany from the University of Georgia and a BA in plant science from Penn State. So Brian, take it over, and the floor is yours.
Very good. Thank you, Locke, and welcome everybody. It's wonderful to have so many people join the call. I'm talking to you from my house in Midlothian, outside of Richmond, and I had hopes of having a longleaf pine virtual background, or even better yet, beaming in from a longleaf pine savanna, but that was not going to work. However, I do have some props with me. I have a longleaf pine cone here, about the size of a small pineapple, and this was collected from the very first longleaf pine stand that I visited back in the early 90s when I was a botanist with the Nature Conservancy in North Carolina. And I also have this rather funny looking plant right here. This is a Virginia native longleaf pine, showing off its very long needles in a container, overdue for planting. And I also have a can of Virginia native longleaf pine IPA that was brewed for us back last fall. I'm not going to have that while I talk, but I might enjoy that later on. As you can tell, I'm very interested in longleaf pine. It's one of my favorite trees, and what I want to do over the next 20 minutes is talk with you about why this tree and this forest system is so important to the Nature Conservancy. I want to talk a little bit about the fire ecology and forest ecology around the system, and then talk about what we're doing to rebuild the longleaf pine forests in Virginia. And my hope is that some of you will be inspired, interested in putting on your bucket list a visit to one of our preserves in Virginia to see longleaf pine, to experience the pine savanna forest, and also kindle an interest in learning more about the Nature Conservancy's forest conservation work across Virginia. So with that, let me turn off my video and get into the presentation. So longleaf pine forests are really a centerpiece of the South's forest heritage. They span over 1,000 miles of the coastal plain region from southeast Virginia to central Florida and over to East Texas. And its icon, the longleaf pine, is truly a majestic tree, living up to 400 years in age, nearly 3 times the lifespan of the loblolly pine, and growing to a massive size. This is a champion tree from Aiken, South Carolina, over 100 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter. This tree is incredibly resilient. It thrives in a landscape that is just hammered with wildfire and hurricanes, droughts, floods, and insect outbreaks. And it's the properties that make it so ecologically resilient that also make it a prized timber species. It's incredibly strong and durable. Now, the longleaf system is also one of the most biologically diverse ecosystems in North America and has been designated as one of 36 biodiversity hotspots in the world. It is also, unfortunately, one of the most threatened systems in the country, eliminated from all but 4% of its original range, again, from Virginia to Florida and over to Texas. And it is the combination of these attributes, biodiversity, resiliency, and rarity, that has drawn the Nature Conservancy to longleaf conservation for over 40 years, and in Virginia for the past 20 years. It is one of 3 North American priority ecosystems for the Conservancy that touch down in Virginia, along with the Central Alps and the Chesapeake Bay. And if you're doing continental priority conservation work, Virginia, I would say, is the place to be. So if you drive by or you stand at the edge of a longleaf forest, it is difficult to perceive the complexity and the biological diversity of this system. From afar, it's a rather simple system and structure. You have a pine canopy, an open midstory, and a ground cover dominated by grass. The aha moment comes when you wade out into this forest and start looking at the ground. And each step that you take, there's a chock full of new species. And within a 10-minute walk in this landscape that we're looking here, if you had a botanist with you, you could encounter 100, 140 different species. And within just a square meter, just 1 meter by 1 meter square, in certain parts of the longleaf pine range, you can observe 45 different co-occurring perennial species. And this packing of plant life is unmatched, really, by any other ecosystem in the world. And these plants aren't just any plant. There are orchids, lilies, carnivorous plants, goldenrods, gentians, and a trove of other showy flowering plants. This is a collection of images that were combined from stamps that were printed by the U.S. Postal Service a number of years ago. Only 900 plant species are found here, endemics that we call plants that are restricted to an animal, so restricted to a specific geography. And all of this plant life supports an equally impressive diversity of insect and vertebrate life. And it is this richness that has gained the coastal plain of southeastern United States a recognition as a global hotspot of biodiversity. So the forest settings of the past few slides are noticeably different from the typical forest you see driving through the coastal plain of Southeast Virginia and areas to the south. If land in the coastal plain is left untouched, the natural course of forest growth right now produces a closed canopy, as you're seeing here, mixed hardwood and pine with very little light reaching the forest floor. There's very little plant diversity on the ground. And while this may be the natural and most common forest type now, it was likely infrequent 500 years ago and further back. And we can say that with confidence if we look at the biology of the great majority of native plants of the coastal region. They are shade intolerant by and large. They need a lot of light to grow. And a landscape blanketed by a shade forest could not support this diversity and abundance of plants and animal life. The pine savanna structure, on the other hand, if sustained over a long period of time, millions of years, over a vast area, millions and millions of acres, that is a much more plausible setting for the evolution and spread of so many different light-loving plant species. So the question is, what's changed? Why is the forest closed now, or why did it stay open historically, allowing plants to survive? And as you might have guessed, the answer is fire. Frequent, low-intensity fire to suppress the vertical growth of vegetation to keep the forest open. The question is, how frequent? Given the growth rates of trees that are native to the system they grow along with longleaf pine and all these other plants, given their growth rate, fire ecologists estimate that a fire return interval of 1 to 5 years is needed to prevent hardwood trees from growing to a size where they can escape fire and establish a shade canopy. So think about that. A fire return interval of 1 to 5 years across the entire coastal plain of southeastern United States. How could there have been that much fire? The South was a bucket of fire. It was a fireland because of 3 factors. One is an abundance of fuel. Longleaf pine litter, the litter of grasses, other vegetation, very flammable, just an abundance of fuel ready to be ignited across the landscape. Lots and lots of opportunities for ignition. Southeastern United States is in the lightning belt capital of North America. Every year, within a small geography, hundreds, if not thousands, of lightning strikes can occur. So lots of opportunities for ignition. And then spread. Fire can roll, or could roll, through this landscape because of the connectivity of habitat, the suitable conditions, weather conditions for spread of fire, and the lack of relatively large fire breaks. And so you could have an ignition in Southampton County in June, and that fire could, over weeks and over months, spread to Surrey County, all the way up to the James River, and in the process burn tens, if not hundreds of thousands of acres, all again from one ignition. So all species that occur in the longleaf system are adapted to fire in some way or form, and that's very evident if you visit a longleaf pine stand that has been burned. If you visit a site 2 months after it burns, this is what you see. It's lush regrowth of herbaceous life. The ground cover diversity just comes back so vigorously, and with that as well, a lot of insect life. And one of the most remarkable examples of fire adaptation traits is displayed by the longleaf pine. So unlike most other woody species, longleaf pine will not initiate, when the seed germinates, it will not initiate vertical growth. So loblolly pine is a comparative species there. So 2 pots, longleaf pine, same age seedling. It looks like a grass, and loblolly pine is shooting for the sky. And this strategy is very successful for protecting the growing tip of the seedling, longleaf pine seedling. It's nestled in among those long needles, a lot of moisture, close to the ground where fire intensities are not that high, and it's a trait that allows seedling, which is in its most vulnerable stage of the plant life cycle, to survive fire. And it is absolutely remarkable. It's astonishing every time I see it, that to see a fire, 1,000 degrees, slam into a longleaf pine stand, a young longleaf pine stand, and within several weeks, these studs that you see, that's the base of a longleaf pine seedling. Within several weeks, you'll see a resprout of needles, of foliage. A strategy that explains why a strategy of foregoing vertical growth for protecting seedlings. The success of this is demonstrated by the range of dominance of longleaf pine. Again, Virginia, Central Florida, East Texas. It was the dominant species across that range, and it was fire that selected for that trait. So really, this is a forest that fire built. So with that very brief overview of ecology of longleaf pine, touching on fire, let's talk about the history of longleaf pine in Virginia. We'll start back at the end of the last ice age. We know that from the pollen record, we had boreal forest in southeast Virginia, 1500s or so. The climate began to warm, sea level rise, the coastal forest began moving landward, and forests from the south, vegetation began to move northward following fire. And in 10,000 years ago, Native Americans came to the landscape, and we have good evidence that around 4,000 years ago, Native Americans used fire frequently, and that certainly affected the distribution and abundance of plants across and animals across the landscape. By the early 1600s, at the time of European settlement, ecologists estimate there were 1 million acres of longleaf pine in Virginia, most of it south of the James River, a little bit on the peninsula there. And when Jamestown was established, the settlers, of course, the colonists were, of course, looking for silver, and they didn't find that. But what they did find was arguably a much more valuable resource, and that is the pine. The longleaf pine is a valued species for construction, and is also very valuable for the pitch that it produces. And back in the 1600s, all ships required pitch to seal the holes, to seal the mast, and also as a lubricant. And at the time of European settlement, there was a real shortage of pitch in England. And so the importance of that product was demonstrated or indicated by the fact that in 1608, 1 year after Jamestown was established, the very first, or one of the first commercial exports out of Hampton Roads was a couple of barrels of pitch and tar that were sent to England to help with shipbuilding. Fast forward 240 years or so, and the naval stores industry, the extraction of pitch had disappeared. And by the late 1800s, 1893, a botanist doing a survey of longleaf pine documented that in Virginia, the longleaf pine is for all practical purposes extinct. And then by 2000, a number of biologists did a pretty comprehensive census of longleaf pine trees, original longleaf pine trees, and they could only come up with 200 trees. 200 trees of a forest that was originally 1 million acres in size, and we think that ballpark 250 million trees of that original forest. So an incredible attrition of a tree that had been dominant for so many years. And this collapse of the tree, again, mirrored the collapse of the tree elsewhere across its range. Only 4%, by the year 2000, only 4% of the original longleaf pine forest, again, the tree, remained across southeastern United States. Now, while 350 years or so of unsustainable use had nearly eliminated longleaf pine, the tree, other species of the longleaf forest, and remember, a forest is more than the tree. The tree is the icon, but the forest is the whole assemblage of plant animal life in a space that has trees. Ground cover plants and animals, those species did persist. And we owe a debt of gratitude to a handful of biologists, including our former board member, Dr. Mitchell Bird, who through tireless efforts cataloged the remnant pieces of the original forest. And their work really helped lay the blueprint for where we needed to start to begin rebuilding Virginia's longleaf forest. So we started out very humble beginnings, 1985. The donation of land, a small piece of land in Isle of Wight County along the Blackwater River, now called the Zuni Pine Barrens. This is property that was donated to the Nature Conservancy from Union Camp Corporation, and we in turn transferred it to Old Dominion University. And for 15 years, this is pretty much the extent of longleaf conservation in Virginia. In 1999, the Virginia chapter decided we would have to get off the sidelines and invest in land and forest management capacity if we wanted to influence the fate of longleaf pine in Virginia. And what inspired us was the opportunity to acquire a 2,700 acre tract of mature pine forest in Sussex County. And this was the largest contiguous block of mature pine forest in the coastal plain. And it supported the state's last and largest breeding population of a bird species, a red-cockaded woodpecker, that is tightly linked to pine savanna forests that are The icon is sort of the longleaf pine, more broadly pine savanna forests. And at the time of this purchase of Pine Grove, we had two goals. One was to ensure that this bird did not go extinct on our watch. We just were committed, determined that that was not going to happen. And the other was to use the preserve to engage our public agency partners and private landowners in creating a shared vision for what our coastal plain forest could look like. This view of this forest that you're seeing here was pretty much gone, but we had an opportunity to bring this forest and this view of a forest back. And this shared vision for what our coastal plain forest could look like is really important for building a link between Virginia and other conservation efforts across the longleaf pine ecosystem. Conservation success for this system requires protection and management of representative habitats across the entire range. And there is a unique habitat in Southeast Virginia and Northeast North Carolina, the northern savannas and woodlands type. And we're on the hook to make sure that habitat persists. These edge of range habitats like we have in Southeast Virginia are particularly important in the face of climate change to ensure species have spaces to move to as climate warms. So for TNC, our first step was to begin building the land base. In 1999, we acquired Piney Grove for roughly $4 million, and becoming a landowner was transformational. It put us in a position to begin facilitating land protection projects with our public agency partners and private landowners. We have stepped in and purchased thousands of acres from timberland companies and then helped our agency partners secure funding to acquire those tracts from us to make them available, accessible to the public. We have also helped our partners secure substantial government grants to enable our partners to acquire property directly. And again, being an active landowner, has been a big part of our success in getting federal funds to flow down to Virginia. And we've also accepted donations of conservation easements on key properties, particularly the Bill Owen easement and the Westbrook farm easement. You can see the tracts of land that we've added to the landscape, conserved lands since the Nature Conservancy acquired Piney Grove Preserve in 1999. All told, nearly, or actually over $15 million of funding and donations have flowed into this area following our initial investment of $4 million, and over $10 million of investment of public and private money has been made in other longleaf pine project sites in Southeast Virginia. So step one is establishing the base, building the base. The next step is restoration, and a lot of really challenging, exciting work on this front. So fire, of course, is essential to the health of this system. We can't rely on natural ignitions, on lightning strikes for a variety of reasons. So we have to mimic natural ignitions and use prescribed fire to create fire conditions that are safe and also achieve the conservation outcomes that we are shooting for. A lot of science behind this, looking at fire behavior, the fuels, the weather, and topography that control and influence fire behavior. We have some of the best fire professionals in the organization here in Virginia who have learned how to manage fire in the system, and also, very importantly, have mentored our agency partners to also learn how to use fire for longleaf restoration. Another big step is timber management. Most of the lands that we acquire have dense pine plantation forest cover, and we need to thin that cover down to create light conditions that are favorable for the forest floor vegetation. And so we've worked closely with consultants, with loggers, to develop silvicultural treatments that are good for the forest products industry, getting the wood out of the forests in a way that's economical, and also achieve really good and important conservation outcomes for our ecological targets. Another step is, of course, planting longleaf pine. We had just 200 trees of the original forest. If we want to claw our way back towards having millions of trees in the landscape, we need to plant those. And so we have planted millions of seedlings, we being our partners. And what's really exciting is that the Department of Forestry and Department of Conservation and Recreation and Nature Conservancy, there's now a Virginia native longleaf pine propagation facility at a Department of Forestry nursery in Sussex County, the Garland Gray Nursery Facility. And there have been field studies that have demonstrated that local genotype longleaf pine outperforms longleaf pine seedlings collected from trees further south. So we're using the very best genetic stock to establish longleaf pine. And more recently, we've started to work on propagating and restoring native ground cover. So collecting seed from places like Piney Grove, growing them out in containers, and also distributing that seed in the field to accelerate the pace and scale of ground cover restoration. All this work is done through a very collaborative effort with a bunch of public and private partners. In 2012, we formed we call Longleaf Cooperators of Virginia, and we work together on sharing resources, equipment, and people, on fundraising, on developing a sort of a shared vision for where Virginia's longleaf pine work needs to go, and also on outreach. Really, really important to have this framework in place to get to scale with the restoration that we want to do. After we have our lands protected and we have them moving towards restoration or out of restoration, we then get into what we call maintenance mode, and this is where we need to maintain the fire regime every 1 to 3 years. All of our acreage needs to be burning again to maintain that open canopy. We need to make sure that as the young longleaf pine seedlings come in, they're not competing with other vegetation. And we're also underplanting longleaf pine, gradually replacing loblolly pine with longleaf pine. So more and more of this habitat is coming online, and for the first time in hundreds of years, there is an expansion of this pine savanna habitat in Southeast Virginia. Another step, really important step, is monitoring, evaluating how we're doing in all of our land protection and land management work. And we, along with our partners, are looking at the health and distribution of a number of animal species and also plant species. These are in some ways proxies for the health and condition of the habitats that we're managing for. And I can say that all of these species that we're seeing right here, their numbers have been increasing since we initiated, again, we and our partners initiated longleaf pine restoration efforts 20 years ago. So stepping back, where are we on our scorecard with regards to restoring longleaf pine? So this is a table with some very simple metrics. 1999, where were we? 2019, where are we now? And where do we want to get to? So if we look at longleaf trees in the ground, 1999, 200 trees of those original of the original longleaf forests, add in some others that were planted from non-Virginia stock, in roughly 20,000 estimate longleaf trees in the ground. Now we have 3 million, and we want to get to 60 million. Acres under fire management for pine savanna restoration. 200 acres more or less in 1999. Right now we have 10,000 acres that are online for fire on a 1 to 3 year return interval. And then acres under conservation ownership dedicated to pine savanna restoration. Just a handful of acres in 1999. Now we have 20,000 acres. We've got a long way to go to 75,000 acres, but we've made big strides in getting there. One story that we're very proud of is what we've been able to achieve with the red-cockaded woodpecker. So again, this was a species that was literally just hanging on by its talons. And we had just 2 breeding groups, at one point just 12 individual birds that we could identify at Piney Grove and in 2000. And as you can see from this bar chart, the population has continued to climb, and we're now at 65 birds. And it's safe to say that, it's reasonable to say that if TNC had not stepped up and our partners had not stepped up to protect and manage longleaf Piney Grove Preserve, this graph would show a much different story. Very likely RCW, red-cockaded woodpecker, would be extinct in Virginia. We know a tremendous amount about this bird. That those hands right there, you see somebody holding a 6-day or 7-day-old nestling right there. Each bird in our population is monitored or banded with individual band combinations, and we track the fate of each of those birds. And that work is done by the Center for Conservation Biology. So a great example of using science to inform how we're doing at a really important preserve. So the work that we're doing in Virginia, again, through this partnership, what we call the Longleaf Cooperators of Virginia, we are one of 17 local or longleaf pine implementation teams. And there are literally thousands of others across the range in these groups, private NGO, non-government organizations, nonprofits, public agency biologists, corporations, private landowners, academics, all working together on a common vision, a shared vision to restore longleaf pine. And there's a range-wide conservation plan that inspires and informs the targets that we've set for bringing longleaf pine back. And this is the largest, one of the largest, if not the largest, forest restoration projects in North America. Truly an amazing and inspiring effort to bring back one of the iconic forest systems of North America. So this is the last slide, and the Conservancy's work on longleaf and other ecosystems is grounded by the principle of stewardship, and we and all of our supporters see the opportunity and responsibility to pass along the natural wealth that we've inherited on to the next generation. And Conservancy's work at places like Piney Grove, pictured here, is helping people from across the state, including my daughter Abigail, who I'm holding there. She's 3 there in the picture, now 16. She's nearly as tall as me. It's helping people shape a new narrative about Virginia's natural heritage. And in a very tangible way, I think, our work on longleaf pine in Virginia helps us all recognize the ability we have as humans to restore nature if we apply science, if we build a shared vision, and we commit to long-term, large-scale results. So that's it for my slides, and I'd like to thank all of you for your interest and for your support. And I think we're now going to open it up for questions.
Awesome. This is wonderful work, Brian. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. And thanks to everyone who's been submitting questions and comments throughout. We invite you to continue to share them through the Q&A during this portion of the session. As we said, if we can't get to them all today, which we may not be able to, there's quite a few, it's really exciting. We will answer them after the fact and get those answers out to the group. We are just loving joining you in your curiosity and your fond reminiscence of longleaf. I've seen some of that going on in the chat box on the side too, really neat. Okay, Brian, here we go. Now, please do let me know if you need me to repeat any questions or portions therein. You know, I talk a little fast when I get excited, and this is exciting stuff. So your first question is, how can I save my 20-year-old longleaf pines from being windblown and losing the tops of those trees and then losing the tree?
Well, that's a good question. And I think that, let me just say that if you look at the performance of longleaf pine relative to other southern pine species in windstorm events, longleaf pine is actually more resilient than other southern pines, loblolly pine and slash pine, with regards to how many, during a storm event, how many individuals of those different species will shear off during a hurricane. And longleaf pine, there have been a number, particularly recently with all the hurricanes slamming into the Gulf Coast, there are a number of studies now that have shown that longleaf is more resilient to wind damage. That said, every species has a threshold above which it will snap off, the canopy will snap off. So I think that if a tree is planted in an area where it's exposed to a lot of wind, it's going to be more vulnerable to wind disturbance. So if the the individual who posed the question, looking for a safer place to plant longleaf, I would say in an area that's not as exposed to as much wind fetch.
Great. Thank you. And just a reminder for y'all, I see questions coming in on the Zoom chat, which is wonderful. If you hover your cursor over the screen, at the very bottom of the screen, you'll see a Q&A function with a dialog box. And that is the most efficient way to get the questions in. We'll get to them either way, but that's how we're monitoring them. Okay, Brian, this is a bit of a multifaceted question. Given the increasing awareness of the importance of mycological communities to the healthy functioning of forest ecosystems, has TNC explored doing or inviting university partners to pursue research on the relationships between trees and fungus and conservancy pine land preserves or other places where historic ecosystems are more or less intact? In other words, might this be another place where TNC could be at the forefront of conservation ecology?
That is a great question, and we have so much to learn about the forest below our feet. It's a brown and black box. It's the soil, certainly by the color, but it's also what we know about below ground processes. We just have so much to learn, and I've been thinking about this actually quite a bit, because when we talk about old growth in a forest system, oftentimes we talk about the age of the tree. But again, the forest system is more than the tree. It's all the species. And for a forest system that's dominated by perennial species on the forest floor, it could very well be that there are some perennial plants on the forest floor that have grown vegetatively for thousands of years. And some of the true old growth in our forests could be those smaller plants that have grown and just inch by inch spread over the landscape. And so thinking about when we're trying to conserve the most important pieces of this forest, I think we really need to be thinking about conserving the seed bank, the root bank, the bud bank that is in that soil horizon. And part of that ecology is understanding the relationship between mycorrhizae. So the mycorrhizae, for folks who haven't heard that term, those are fungal interactions. So it's a symbiosis between a fungus and a plant. The fungus actually infects the plant, but it's a positive thing for the plant because the fungus can forage for nutrients that would otherwise not be available to the plant. And the fungus benefits by way of the carbohydrates that a tree can fix by way of photosynthesis. So really important association between fungi and plants at the root level. And I think there are some researchers with the U.S. Forest Service and some universities further south that are trying to understand the interactions between mycorrhizae and the productivity of longleaf pine, and also the resiliency of longleaf pine to various stresses. So I think it is an area that we need to know a lot more about. I think there's some research going on. I'd be happy to follow up and provide some more information, some links to some papers that I'm aware of.
Great. Okay. Are there plans to expand this property or project? What would be needed to do this?
Well, all this work, it takes money, and buying land and the people that we need to manage the land. And we have been very fortunate with all the support that we received for land acquisition and for our land management efforts. And I think people and corporations and foundations and government agencies give to the Nature Conservancy, particularly give to the Nature Conservancy for our work in Southeast Virginia, because we deliver. We're science-based, we're collaborative, we've got a big vision, we've got our boots on the ground, and we can be trusted to deliver on the donations that are given to us to advance forest conservation. And we're also very strategic with the donations that we receive. And so when we take $1 from a donor, we like to use that money to unlock money from other sources. And right now we are sitting on several large acquisitions and land acquisitions. And if we can get $50,000 of private money, that can unlock over $1 million of funding that we need to acquire those 2 tracts that we have teed up. So to answer your question, what we really need is financial support to help us acquire those really important pieces, and then also to support our land management work.
Thank you. All right. Can longleaf pines be planted as an understory tree in an existing loblolly pine forest, or do they need to be planted in clear-cut or open property?
The answer is both. So longleaf pine is a light dependent species. It doesn't do well in a shaded setting. And so the best setting for establishing longleaf pine is in a wide open, sort of a clear-cut area. That said, there are ways to use silviculture treatments in a pine stand to create small gaps in a forest, an existing forest, to create the conditions, light conditions that are suitable for longleaf growth, seedling growth. So, and that's something that we are working on right now to better understand. We actually have a project at Bill Owens Preserve that we've mentioned, and also on Nature Conservancy property and some of our agency properties to study how to underplant longleaf pine to accelerate opportunities, increase opportunities for longleaf establishment, because we can't just wait until there's a clear cut for us to plant longleaf pine. We really need to increase the pace of how much longleaf is being planted. And the way to get there, we think, is to do more underplanting of longleaf pine in established loblolly pine stands.
Cool. All right. Is there a difference between a Virginia longleaf and one from the southern part of the range?
Yes, there is. The Department of Forestry, so if you look at a tree from Virginia versus one from the Gulf Coast, typically the needles are longer from specimens that are further south. So that's one sort of morphological difference that is observable. There have been studies done by the Department of Forestry, field studies, that have looked at the survival and growth of longleaf seedlings that were grown from seed collected from various sites throughout the range. So Louisiana was one seed source, I think Georgia, and then the Carolinas, and then Virginia stock. And that study demonstrated clearly that Virginia stock had much higher survival rates and better or greater growth rates than seedlings that were planted, again, seed collected from further south. So it's not that much of a surprise, but as it is with most native plant restoration projects, you want to use as local seed source or genotypes as possible. And that's what we're trying to do as much as we can in Virginia with longleaf pine.
Where can we get longleaf seedlings? Will it grow in Western Virginia? Can it be used as an urban street tree?
That's a great question. As far as seedling availability, right now the Department of Forestry has a limited number of longleaf seedlings that they make available through their nursery. You can go online, Department of Forestry, they have an online store, and you can order longleaf pine seedlings. There are also seedlings that are available through growers in North Carolina. Again, if you go online and you search for longleaf pine seedlings, you can find some information there, and we can post that information as a follow-up to this talk. As far as how the tree would perform in Western Virginia, I think that it's very likely that in a moderate site where we don't have brutal winter conditions, extended frost periods, that a seedling would survive. I'm not sure if there was a stand planted, if there would be seed production, if pollination or fertilization and seed establishment would be something that could happen. I will say that one of the largest trees that we have of specimens of longleaf pine that we have in Virginia is now Albemarle County on somewhere in Charlottesville on property that was owned or is owned by the Department of Forestry. It was a specimen that was planted for, I think, research purposes years ago, and it's thriving. So that is the furthest west occurrence that I'm aware of, but I wouldn't be surprised if longleaf pine is further west in the state. As far as it being a street tree, I've not seen it planted for that purpose, but I've seen plenty of a longleaf pine in urban settings, town settings, and I think it's a magnificent tree. So Southern Pines, North Carolina, Aiken, South Carolina, Townsville, Georgia, Wilmington, North Carolina, these are all towns that come to mind where I've seen longleaf pine in an urban setting, and it's a beautiful tree. So I'd love to see more of it planted for those purposes. We'll have to see how that works out as the tree becomes better known and more seasons become available.
Cool. Oh, we've got an October forest question here, Brian, related to one of your fabulous props. What is the story behind the Longleaf IPA?
Well, that is a great story. So there is a local brewer on the Eastern Shore. And I'm terrible with names, and so I feel terrible about, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he lived in Virginia most of his life, and one day picked up the Pilot, Virginia Pilot newspaper for Hampton Roads, and read about the longleaf pine story and red-cockaded woodpeckers in Piney Grove, and he said, "Oh my God, this is a great article by Peter Cotu, the writer, and you can find that online." And we could link that, provide that link after our talk here. Anyway, I think his name was Josh. I feel terrible about this. Anyway, he said, "Oh my gosh, there's this amazing story about this forest that I've never heard about. And I'm from Virginia, and I care about the environment. I've never heard this." He had been doing some work with our folks at the Virginia Coast Reserve, I think working on oyster projects, and thinking of, I think had worked maybe on a brew for Virginia Coast Reserve focused around oysters. And anyway, after he read this story in the Pilot about longleaf pine, he reached out and said, "Hey, can I make a brew using pine needles?" And we said, "Yeah, that'd be great." And so he went out to Pine Grove, collected a bunch of longleaf pine needles, threw it in the mash, brewed it, and out it came. And it's a delicious beer. So we're very the fact that a story in a paper inspired a brewer to make a small batch IPA is just one way of sort of demonstrating how this story about longleaf pine and the restoration of this forest system inspires people. And we'll provide some more information about the brewer and about the beer again in our follow-up information.
All about connections. We hope they'll participate in October Forest again this year too. It was really cool to see the photos of them mixing all those needles and cones into the beer, and it was unbelievably delicious. Anyway, our next question is, how much of the Dismal Swamp was originally longleaf pine?
Well, great question, and I think that longleaf pine was very limited in the Dismal Swamp as far as the abundance. The Dismal Swamp, the western boundary of the Dismal Swamp is a relic shoreline from 100,000 years ago. It's called the Suffolk Scarp. You can actually see it if you look at an aerial image of the coastal plain. You can see the strip of what looks like a sand ridge along the western boundary of the Dismal Swamp. Very likely on those well-drained soils, longleaf pine occurred there, and I think actually we have some specimens that are in herbaria that document longleaf pine being on that sand ridge. So, but the Dismal Swamp itself, when we think about the Dismal Swamp, it's a wetland system that is just east of that scarp, the Suffolk Scarp. And in those deep peat soils, those are not suitable growing conditions for longleaf pine. In that forest system, the dominant conifers are bald cypress and Atlantic white cedar. And it's possible that on the far eastern edge, historically the Dismal Swamp was 1 million acres, if you can imagine that. It's 150 acres now, more or less. But as the Dismal Swamp feathered out, the organic soils feathered out to the east, to get towards the coast, Virginia Beach, on some of those shallow organic soils, it's possible that longleaf pine was there. It would be the soil conditions and the opportunity for prescribed fire for natural fire in those settings that would give longleaf pine an opportunity to establish. But good question. But two other really remarkable conifer species in the Dismal Swamp. Bald cypress, which can grow to 2,600 years, one of the top, I think it's the 6th oldest tree documented on Earth. It's a 2,600-year-old bald cypress in eastern North Carolina, and then the Atlantic white cedar, which is a remarkable conifer that is restricted to a narrow belt along the Atlantic coastal plain and a few spots on the Gulf Coast. So everybody needs to go see the Dismal Swamp and experience those trees in that forest setting as well.
That's great. Brian, you just accidentally answered another question that's on the list, and I'm so glad because I wasn't sure we'd have time to get to it. This is actually going to be our final question. You guys have been sending in some really wonderful thoughts and questions. We will get to all of them after the fact. Feel free to keep submitting them, even if we can't answer them live. So Brian, your final question is going to be, how did we shrink from the original 1 million acres to only 200 trees by the mid-1980s?
Yeah, so DeSoto, he brought 200 hogs to Florida and back in the 1500s, and that's part of the story. So what happened was, at the time of European settlement, the naval storage industry that I mentioned, the extraction of pine, pitch, weakened the forests, and some of the forest was harvested for construction. What happened is the second generation forest largely didn't come back or was restricted because of the foraging from feral hogs. There were tens of thousands per county, tens of thousands of wild hogs in southeastern Virginia, and they foraged heavily on seed. Longleaf pine has really large seed, and also the seedlings, which are very have high nutrition levels. Much like wild hogs foraged on chestnuts in the mountains, the longleaf pine free-range hogs feasted on longleaf pine seedlings. So we lost an opportunity because of the hogs that were introduced, several hundred, and that exploded in abundance through the 1600s, 1700s. We lost an opportunity for that second generation forest to come back. So there was that, and then there was also a conversion of longleaf pine forest to farmland, and then sort of the nail in the coffin was the suppression of fire, the removal of fire from the landscape. So there's a long story there, but there were several really powerful blows to the longleaf system over the course of 200 years, 200, 300 years.
All right, great. Well, that was our final question for the live session. And again, as I mentioned, we will respond to any lingering questions after the fact and get the information out to y'all. Brian, thank you so much for your knowledge and expertise. And friends who have joined us, thank you for your curiosity and your interest. Now back to Locke to send us on our way. Y'all take care, and thanks again.
Oh, thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Brian. That was a really great presentation. I never knew the hog fact before, so I learned something new, as I always do. And I hope that the rest of you really enjoyed this. And you can see what a real privilege it is to have the role I have as the Virginia State Director at TNC, because I get to work with wonderful people like Brian, who are knowledgeable and passionate about their work. And I just want to thank you all for joining us. And I really want to thank you for your support for our work. We couldn't do it without you. I'm just going to reiterate what Margaret said, that you'll be hearing from us with a follow-up email that'll give you a recording of this webinar and the additional materials you've heard us talk about. And I want you just to know that it will include contact for both Brian and for me. And so please feel free to reach out with any questions that you've got about today's session or any thoughts about what we could do to make it better. And our next webinar is going to be on Wednesday, July the 1st, excuse me, not the 4th, the 1st of July. And Jill Bieri, who heads up our work at our Virginia Coast Reserve, is going to talk about the exciting work they're doing on the eastern shore of Virginia as that program enters its 50th year. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you for being our partners in this important work. And I hope you all stay safe and stay well. Take care.